July 1944. The heat was unbearable. Private Karl Weiss, aged 22, stood with his hands raised beside a hedgerow in northern France, his rifle lying useless in the dirt. The fighting had stopped only seconds earlier. Smoke still drifted across the field. Somewhere behind him, an American Sherman tank idled, its engine humming like a distant storm. Karl had survived 3 years of war. He had survived the frozen nights outside Kharkov, the retreat through Italy, the endless marches with blistered feet and an empty stomach. He had watched friends disappear one by one, some buried, some simply gone. And now, just weeks after D-Day, the war for him was over. An American soldier approached carefully, rifle lowered, but ready. He didn't shout. He didn't strike Karl. He simply gestured for him to turn around. Karl expected anger, revenge, maybe worse. Instead, the soldier offered him a cigarette. Karl hesitated, then took it with trembling fingers. That small gesture confused him more than any battlefield ever had. Within hours, Karl was herded with dozens of other German prisoners onto the back of a truck. No blindfolds, no beatings, just orders barked in English he barely understood. The truck rolled south, away from the front lines, away from the war that had consumed his entire adult life. For days they were moved from camp to camp, interrogated briefly, fed more regularly than Karl had eaten in months. He kept waiting for the treatment to change, for the cruelty he had been warned about since basic training. It never came. 2 weeks later, Karl stood on the deck of a transport ship in the Atlantic, staring at the endless water. The guards told them they were being sent far away, somewhere safe, somewhere the war could not reach them. Some prisoners whispered rumors. They'll send us to forced labor camps. They'll leave us to starve. They'll never let us go home. Karl didn't believe any of it. After years of war, belief had become a luxury he no longer trusted. All he knew was that the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and the continent he was leaving behind was burning. 10 days later, early in the morning, Karl saw land again. Palm trees, bright sunlight, a shoreline that looked nothing like Europe. An American guard leaned against the railing and spoke casually, almost cheerfully. "Welcome to Florida." Karl blinked. Florida? He had imagined concrete prisons, snow, darkness. Instead, the air was warm, the sky cloudless, and the scent of salt and pine drifted across the harbor. As the ship docked, Karl felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Not fear, confusion. Because for the first time since the war began, nothing made sense anymore. And he had no idea that within days he would experience something so strange, so unexpected, that it would stay with him for the rest of his life, long after the war had ended. The war had taken everything from him, but America was about to give him something he never expected. The trucks arrived just before sunset. Karl Weiss sat on a wooden bench in the back, watching palm trees blur past as the convoy rolled through central Florida. The road was smooth, no bomb craters, no burned villages, just long stretches of forest, open sky, and the occasional farmhouse. After everything he had seen in Europe, the calm felt unnatural. The truck slowed, then turned through a wide gate. A sign stood beside the road. U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp. Karl leaned forward, squinting. That was it. No watchtowers with machine guns, no concrete walls, just a single barbed wire fence and wooden guard towers spaced far apart. It looked less like a prison and more like a training base or a summer camp. The prisoners were ordered down from the trucks and assembled on an open field. An American officer stepped forward. He removed his cap before speaking. A translator stood beside him. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army," the officer said calmly. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Carl exchanged glances with the man beside him. No shouting, no threats. The officer continued, "You will receive 3 meals per day. You will be housed in barracks. You will work. You will be paid. If you follow the rules, you will have no problems." Paid? Carl was sure he had misheard. The formation was dismissed, and guards guided the prisoners toward long wooden barracks. Inside, Carl stopped walking. Beds, real beds, steel frames, mattresses, pillows, clean blankets folded neatly at the foot. Sunlight poured through screened windows, and ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Carl sat down on one of the beds and pressed his hand into the mattress. It sank under his weight. He had slept on dirt, concrete, frozen ground, and tank armor. He had not slept on a mattress since 1941. That evening, they were marched to the mess hall. Carl carried a metal tray, still expecting the food to disappear before he reached the table. It didn't. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, coffee. Not thin soup, not scraps. Actual food. Carl ate slowly, carefully, watching the guards for any sign this was some kind of trick. When he finished, a cook nodded at his tray. "More?" Carl froze, then nodded. He returned to his seat with a second helping, his hands shaking slightly. Around him, men whispered in disbelief. Some laughed nervously. Others stared down at their trays as if afraid to look up. That night, Carl lay awake on his bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning above him. Outside, insects chirped. Somewhere in the distance, a guard whistled. No artillery, no shouting, no explosions, just Florida night air and the soft creak of wooden buildings. Carl realized something that unsettled him deeply. For the first time since he had put on a uniform, he felt safe. The next morning, a whistle blew at dawn. Breakfast was waiting. And with it, the beginning of a routine that would challenge everything Carl believed about enemies, war, and captivity. Because later that day, an American sergeant would read out work assignments, and Carl Weiss would hear his name, assigned not to punishment, not to interrogation, but to a place that would change him forever, a lake. 3 days after arriving at the camp, the work details began. Hans Müller stood in formation at 6:30 in the morning, the Minnesota air still cool, the sun just beginning to lift above the trees. An American sergeant walked down the line with a clipboard, reading names and assignments. When Müller heard his name, it was followed by words he didn't expect. Farm detail, civilian labor. Müller exchanged glances with the men beside him. Civilian labor meant leaving the camp. It meant trucks, open roads, and towns with no barbed wire. It also meant responsibility. If anyone tried to escape, the entire work detail would lose the privilege. Within an hour, Müller and 30 other prisoners were riding in the back of an open-bed truck, guarded by just 2 American soldiers sitting casually near the tailgate. No machine guns, no handcuffs. The truck passed through the camp gate, and for the first time since his capture, Müller was outside a prison fence. The road stretched through farmland and small towns, wooden houses, red barns, children riding bicycles, women hanging laundry in backyards. No one stared at the truck in fear. Some waved. One boy saluted sarcastically and laughed. Müller didn't know what unsettled him more, the lack of hatred or the normalcy. They arrived at a dairy farm owned by a man named Robert Caldwell. He was in his early 50s, wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed hat. Two of his sons were serving overseas, one in Italy, one somewhere in the Pacific. Caldwell looked at the prisoners, then at the American guard. "Long as they work," he said, "they'll eat." The guard translated, "No threats, no speeches." The work was physical, but straightforward, repairing fences, cleaning stalls, stacking hay. Mueller had worked with machines before the war, not animals, but labor was labor. By mid-morning, his hands were blistered, his back aching. Still, he worked steadily. So did everyone else. At noon, Caldwell's wife rang a bell. Lunch. The prisoners sat on overturned crates under the shade of a tree. Mrs. Caldwell brought out metal containers and handed each man a plate. Thick slices of bread, beans with meat, milk, actual cold milk. Mueller drank it slowly. He hadn't tasted fresh milk since 1941. No one rushed them. No one counted bites. After lunch, Caldwell's daughter appeared with a basket of apples. She was about 15. She hesitated, then placed the basket on the ground between the prisoners and walked away without a word. The gesture stayed with Mueller all afternoon. When the workday ended, Caldwell thanked them. Not formally, just a nod and a simple, "Good work." On the ride back to camp, one of the prisoners, a former infantry corporal named Weber, whispered, "If this is captivity, I don't understand the war anymore." Mueller didn't answer, but the thought lodged itself deep. Over the next weeks, the routine continued. Different farms, different towns, same pattern. Work, food, brief contact with civilians who treated them not as monsters, but as inconvenient laborers, and sometimes as men. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near a road, a pickup truck slowed. An elderly man leaned out and shouted in broken German, "You boys from the camp?" Mueller nodded. The man threw them a pack of cigarettes and drove off without another word. That night, Mueller lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the camp. No artillery, no engines, no screaming. Just wind and insects. For the first time since the war began, his body was exhausted in a way that felt normal. Not fear, not survival, work. And somewhere beneath the fatigue, an uncomfortable realization began to form. If the enemy treated prisoners like this, what had he been fighting for? The announcement came without ceremony. After morning roll call, the camp commandant stepped onto a wooden platform and spoke briefly. A translator repeated the message in German. Selected work details will be reassigned today. Destination, coastal maintenance, follow instructions, no deviations. Mueller barely reacted. Work was work. Farms, factories, forests. It was all the same now. An hour later, he realized this assignment was different. The trucks didn't turn inland. They drove south, toward open sky, and the smell of salt carried faintly through the air. The road flattened. Pine trees thinned. The horizon widened. Someone whispered the word first. Water. By the time the trucks stopped, there was no doubt. Before them stretched a wide, pale beach. Not Normandy. No obstacles, no smoke, no wreckage. Just sand, rolling waves, and an endless blue horizon. Florida. Mueller stood frozen in the truck bed, staring. He had not seen the ocean without violence since he left Germany in 1941. And even then, it had been filled with tension, submarines, orders, fear. Now the beach was alive with civilians, families, children, couples walking barefoot near the waterline. A few American soldiers lounged nearby, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. No defensive positions, no urgency. One of the guards turned to the prisoners. "You'll be cleaning debris along the shoreline. Storm damage. Stay within the marked area." That was it. No warning about escape. No threats. As they climbed down from the truck, Mueller noticed something that made his chest tighten. There was no fence. Just open beach. Open water. The prisoners worked in silence at first, collecting driftwood, broken planks, bits of washed-up debris. The sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down. Sweat soaked their uniforms. Then Weber spoke quietly. If someone ran, they wouldn't stop him. Mueller knew he was right. A man could walk into the crowd, blend in, disappear. The thought terrified him more than barbed wire ever had. Around noon, the guard shouted, "Break!" The prisoners gathered near the trucks. One of the Americans opened a crate and began handing out canteens and sandwiches. Ham, cheese, white bread. Mueller sat on the sand and ate, staring at the waves. A group of children ran past, laughing, chasing each other into the surf. One boy slipped and fell, splashing water everywhere. His mother laughed and pulled him up. A German prisoner named Franz, former artillery, began to cry silently. "I shelled beaches like this," he said. "In Italy." No one responded. Then something happened that no one expected. One of the American guards removed his boots and rolled up his trousers. He walked toward the water and stepped in, letting the waves wash over his ankles. He turned back to the prisoners. "You've got 10 minutes, he said casually. "Just don't be stupid." No translation was needed. Mueller stood slowly. His heart pounded. He walked toward the water like a man approaching a memory he wasn't sure was real. The sand was hot beneath his feet. The surf was cool. When the water touched his skin, his breath caught. It wasn't fear. It was relief. Around him, other prisoners waded in. Some laughed nervously. Some simply stood still, letting the waves move around their legs. No one tried to swim away. No one ran. For 10 minutes, the war felt impossibly far away. Then the guard whistled. Time was up. The prisoners returned without resistance, without argument. They put their boots back on, picked up their tools, went back to work. On the ride back to camp, no one spoke. That night, Mueller wrote in his notebook. Not a letter, just words for himself. If I wanted to escape today, I could have. I didn't. I don't know what that means. But deep down, he already suspected the truth. Freedom, he was learning, was not always about open gates. Sometimes it was about not needing to run. The rumors started quietly. Letters reached Germany through the Red Cross. Carefully written, carefully censored. No complaints, no accusations, just facts. I am healthy. I work during the day. I eat well. The guards follow the Geneva Convention. Families read the lines again and again, searching for what was not said. In Stuttgart, Hamburg, Munich, people whispered, "Our sons are eating better than we are." At Camp Blanding, Mueller noticed the change before he understood it. The guards were the same. The work continued, but something invisible had shifted. Civilians had started paying attention. When the trucks passed through nearby towns, people stopped to look. Not with anger, with curiosity. Sometimes confusion. One afternoon, while returning from a work detail, an elderly woman stood near the road holding a small paper bag. As the truck slowed, she raised it toward the prisoners. The guard hesitated, then nodded. She tossed the bag into the truck bed. Inside were apples, fresh, polished. Mueller held one in his hands, unsure what to do with it. He hadn't received a gift from a stranger since before the war. He ate it slowly, expecting the moment to be taken back. It wasn't. At work sites, Americans began talking to them, not shouting, talking. A farmer asked Mueller where he was from. When Mueller answered, the man nodded and said his grandparents had come from Bavaria in 1898. "We fought the Kaiser once too," the farmer said. "Didn't make them bad people." That sentence stayed with Mueller. In the camp, friendships formed where none should have existed. There was Sergeant Collins, who guarded the mess hall and quietly practiced German phrases. There was Private Lewis, barely 19, who asked endless questions about Europe and admitted he had never been farther than Ohio before the war. One evening, Lewis pointed at Mueller's hands. "You're not a soldier's hands," he said. "You're a worker's." Mueller didn't know how to respond, because the truth was uncomfortable. He was sleeping in a clean bed, eating 3 meals a day, working predictable hours, writing letters. Meanwhile, the war continued in Europe. In late autumn, a letter arrived from his mother. The paper was thin, the handwriting unsteady. Stuttgart had been bombed again. Food was rationed. Coal was scarce. Winter was coming. Mueller read the letter twice. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of men who had once been his comrades in uniform. The guilt arrived without warning. Why was he safe? Why was he warm? Why was he eating meat, while children in his city searched rubble for firewood? Some prisoners became bitter, others became withdrawn. A few convinced themselves this kindness was temporary, a trick that would end without warning. Schmidt said it out loud one evening. "They're making us comfortable so we forget who we are." Mueller disagreed, but softly. "No," he said. "They're reminding us." The Americans didn't treat them like heroes or like victims. They treated them like people. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because when the enemy becomes human, the war stops making sense. By winter, Mueller understood something he couldn't explain in a letter. If he survived this war, he would never be the man he was before. Not because of what he had suffered, but because of what he had been given. Winter arrived quietly. No sirens, no explosions, just colder mornings and shorter days. At Camp Blanding, the men learned to measure time by routine instead of fear. Mueller worked indoors now, assigned to a maintenance detail repairing equipment and sorting supplies. His hands were busy, his mind often wasn't. Then the news began to leak in. Not official announcements, not speeches, just fragments. A guard mentioned Paris had been liberated. Another said the Allies were pushing deep into Germany. Someone heard that American troops were near the Rhine. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. The camp commandant eventually confirmed it during roll call. "The war in Europe is entering its final phase." No cheering, no protest, just silence. For the first time since his capture, Mueller felt something close to dread. Victory was supposed to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like an approaching reckoning. Letters from home slowed. When they came, they were shorter, more careful. His mother wrote that the city was crowded with refugees, that ration cards were often useless, that people were tired, very tired. Then, one morning, a notice was posted outside the administration building, Red Cross mail available. Mueller stood in line longer than usual. When his name was called, he recognized the envelope immediately. His brother's handwriting. The letter had been written weeks earlier. The words were neat, almost cheerful. His brother talked about surviving another winter, about hope, about the belief that the war would end soon. Mueller reached the last line. There was no signature. Attached was a separate note. Typed. Official. Missing in action. Presumed killed. Mueller folded the papers carefully. He didn't cry. He didn't move. That night, he volunteered for extra duty. Guarded storage rooms, late shifts, anything to avoid the barracks. An American guard named Collins noticed. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Mueller nodded. Collins didn't press. He handed Mueller a cup of coffee and stood beside him in silence. That moment stayed with Mueller longer than any speech ever could. A man whose uniform once meant death to him now shared grief without judgment. As winter deepened, the camp changed. Security was relaxed. Work schedules shortened. Talk of after replaced talk of during. Some prisoners dreamed of going home. Others feared it. Mueller wasn't sure which group he belonged to. Germany, in his mind, was no longer a place. It was an absence. Rubble. Names crossed out on lists. A past that could not be repaired. One evening, Schmidt asked the question everyone had avoided. "What will you do when this ends?" Mueller didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know I don't want to live only because others didn't." The war had taken much from him, but it had also shown him something impossible to ignore. The world could be different, and surviving meant choosing what to do with that knowledge. Spring arrived slowly in Minnesota. The snow melted into muddy fields, rivers swelled with runoff, and birds returned to sing over the pine forests surrounding Camp Blanding. It was May 1945. The war in Europe was officially over. The camp loudspeakers announced the surrender. Germany had fallen. For many prisoners, the words were relief. For Mueller, they brought a new kind of uncertainty. The Americans treated the announcement quietly. No parades, no celebrations, just calm, professional voices instructing the men to continue with their routines until transport home could be arranged. Mueller felt strange. He had been waiting for freedom for almost a year, waiting for the day he could leave the camp and return to Stuttgart. Yet, now that it had come, he hesitated. Letters from home were slow to arrive. Those that did speak of destruction, of empty streets, and of families struggling to survive. His parents were alive, yes, but their home had been bombed. His city was occupied, divided. Returning felt hollow. The Americans began offering prisoners options: wait for transport back to Germany, or remain in the U.S., temporarily to work and rebuild under supervision. For some, the offer was absurd. For Mueller, it was tempting. He thought of the Peterson farm, where he had worked since June 1944, of the family who had trusted him, fed him, taught him new ways of life, of the first real meal he had in months, of beds without lice, of blankets that didn't scratch. He remembered his brother, lost in the East, and the fragments of letters that had arrived too late. Returning to Germany would mean walking into grief, destruction, and uncertainty. Staying meant building something entirely new. Mueller spent hours walking the camp, thinking. He walked past the barracks where men were playing chess, past the lake where some prisoners fished and swam, past the fields that had once seemed endless chores and now felt like small victories over hunger and fear. He returned to the Peterson farmhouse that evening. Mr. Peterson was in the kitchen, slicing bread for dinner. "You've made good progress here," Peterson said. "You've worked hard, and the farm could use someone like you. You don't have to decide now, but if you choose to stay, I can help with papers, employment, maybe even citizenship one day." Mueller nodded, silent. He felt the weight of the world pressing on him. He could leave the past behind, or he could return to it. Both choices were permanent. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Freedom isn't only leaving this camp. Freedom is choosing what life I want next. Germany is gone in ways I can't rebuild. But maybe I can make something here. Maybe I can survive and still be human." Sleep came late. When he woke, he knew the answer. The next morning, he approached Peterson. "I'll stay," he said simply. Peterson smiled. "Good. You'll start paperwork tomorrow." Mueller didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He felt determination. Determination to make the second chance matter. June 1946 arrived with the thick heat of a Minnesota summer. Hans Mueller, no longer just a German POW, had signed the papers to remain in America. The Peterson farm had become his home. Each morning, he rose before dawn, tending to fields of corn and soybeans, learning the rhythm of American agriculture. The work was familiar, yet entirely new. Machines replaced hose, irrigation systems replaced hand waterings, and the methods were precise, efficient. Mr. Peterson guided him patiently, explaining crop rotation, fertilization, and market schedules. Slowly, Mueller understood that this farm wasn't just about survival. It was about building something tangible, lasting, and independent. Evenings were quiet. He practiced English with Mrs. Peterson and the daughter, listening to radio broadcasts, reading newspapers, and writing letters home. Letters he now composed with care, describing a life that his family could scarcely imagine. Meals of real meat, beds without lice, summers spent under an open sky instead of in foxholes or tanks. By winter, Mueller had begun saving. Every cent earned from the farm and occasional labor for the Peterson family went toward a down payment on a small plot of land adjacent to the farm. The idea of owning his own piece of America was dizzying. It was freedom, yes, but also responsibility, the kind he had never known in war. Over the next few years, Mueller worked tirelessly. He studied farming methods, improved his English, and slowly integrated into the community. He made friends, attended church services, and even began courting Margaret Hansen, a young woman whose family had emigrated from Norway decades earlier. In 1951, they married. The wedding was modest but filled with warmth. Friends from the church, neighbors, and the Peterson family attended. It was a life that once seemed impossible, a second chance offered in a country that had been his enemy. Children came, 3 in total. Mueller taught them both German and English, instilling lessons of hard work, empathy, and resilience. Yet, he never forgot his past. The friends lost, the battles fought, the brother who had died far from here. Those memories haunted him quietly, shaping him, reminding him why this second chance was precious. In 1952, he became an American citizen. Standing in the federal courthouse, he recited the oath of allegiance. "I swear to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America." Each word felt heavy and sacred. Mueller understood the full weight of his journey. From a young soldier in tanks and foxholes, to a prisoner of war, to a man claiming a new identity in a land that had once been his enemy's. Decades passed. Mueller farmed, raised his family, and participated in his community. he never returned to Germany. The country he had once called home was still rebuilding, still scarred by the war. His parents and remaining relatives eventually passed. Yet, in Minnesota, he had built a life filled with dignity, purpose, and quiet happiness. He kept the photograph from Camp Blanding, a group of prisoners standing by the lake, wet and smiling, as a reminder. A reminder that humanity could exist even in the midst of war, that kindness could bridge enemies, and that survival was more than enduring. It was learning to live again. When Mueller passed away in 2011 at the age of 89, hundreds attended his funeral. Former neighbors, students he had taught through years of storytelling, and even descendants of the Peterson family came to honor a man who had survived not just a war, but the moral and emotional weight it left behind. His life proved something simple yet profound. Even amid destruction and cruelty, people could rebuild, heal, and find mercy, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, steady choices to act with decency. A former enemy soldier had become a neighbor, a husband, a father, a citizen of a new world. And in Minnesota, where fields of corn stretched toward the horizon and the lake reflected the sky in calm waters, Hans Mueller's story remained a testament to the fragile, enduring power of humanity.